we go directly to the audience? Yes, who would like to ask a question, please?
Hi, my name's Nico MacDonald. I'm a writer on innovation. I really enjoyed that. Two very short questions. One, I've noticed with domains like .mobi, the original concept of the browser, for instance, was that the browser would, on a client, would be delivered potentially the type of content that was appropriate for that. For instance, a mobile browser would identify itself with a particular user agent and be delivered the right kind of content, whereas the .mobi concept seems to break that and say you create specific kind of content on your website or other service for this thing. I wonder what your thoughts are, I guess particularly Paul, on this, about whether that approach to top-level domains is actually appropriate. Secondly, someone made a comment, I think again it was you, Paul, that maybe it's time we had something new. Now it seems to me we've already got two things. One was identified as Google, which took up an idea that real names, started by a friend of mine, Keith Tier, conceived in the mid-90s, which was natural language names for things. So GM, Chevrolet or whatever, to get you to the Chevrolet site. And Google sort of done that in a very ad hoc way. And maybe instead of all this discussion about IDNs and CCTLDs and so on, we need to be thinking about enhancing more natural language ways of finding resources online. Secondly, Facebook has, to some extent, gotten around the problem of spam by making us identify the people who are in our network and who can contact us and be received directly. So maybe those kind of things are building on, but actually solving some of the problems that we've talked about today, and maybe the problems aren't as grand as we think they are.
Thank you for your question. I think it was partly addressed to you, Paul.
Let me. It's a very target-rich environment. I tend to be one of the people that believes that it's better to try things out and have several evolutionary steps. So the reason mail works is that we tried out 3 different methods in 3 years and moved on. I think that the conspicuous failures in the DNS world, things like DNSSEC, which have taken more than a decade, and still, to my mind, they may be good enough to actually survive. I mean, it's not really a question of beauty or anything. It's sort of natural selection. Will it survive? You know, it's just too long a period. So I'm sort of in favor of trying things out and seeing whether they work. And so I think more experimentation would be a good thing. And I think we have a bunch of august people on the ICANN board that will see that people don't get too crazy, but I'd like to see some of these experiments run because I don't think there's any danger of destroying the planet, say. You know, and that's sort of a little bit of guidance I would hand out. In the earlier session I said, you know, I think that ICANN has until maybe the end of 2008 to figure out how to do IDNs or they'll be done for them. Because I think that a lot of people are going to try that sort of thing out, and they'll figure out how to get it on the air regardless, and you know, and the network will survive. I worry a little bit that when I go to Korea, all of a sudden, you know, if I go to Korea now, it's great because I can see all of the domain names and I can find companies by just seeing them up there. When they go to natural language, I won't be able to do that anymore, so that'll be a little bit inconvenient for me, although presumably more convenient for Koreans, and maybe that's, yeah, maybe that was the point.
I think it was, yeah.
So, you know, but I wonder, you know, I mean, I certainly approve the idea that, you know, air traffic control is all done in English mostly. Actually, isn't really all done in English, but, you know, mostly you can use it as a default, you know, and that seems like a good idea for that kind of context. I wonder on the internet whether we're going to find similar kinds of issues where this multilingualism isn't going to be such a great idea. We'll see.
I think this is a good place to apply Jonathan's theory about lunacy. The ICANN board's gone, in my time, went back numerous times, and it's gone back and forth more times since I was replaced. If we were doing this through the ITU, there would be a taxonomic frame of mind that said, well, of course you've got to organize this and structure it. And you can't possibly have a system that says, well, if somebody shows up and wants a sponsored TLD and says we have this affinity group and we really want to do this, and oh, by the way, we've got enough in our bank account to at least get it off the ground, then they get to do it. you know. So that argument, that back and forth about the taxonomic structured, we've thought this out, versus the, hey, we got some guys who want to try something, that's still reverberating around. And Dennis's questions are on that same point. You know, Dennis and I both suffer from the fact we've been at this for a long time, and we see some things being said about IDNs that sound to us like absolutely a recipe for blowing up the ship. But we're not sure. And so that's going to be interesting to watch how the board wrestles that out.
Thank you.
Any more from the podium? No. There's a question in the back of the room. Latif Ladid, please.
Thank you, Latif Ladid. Maybe a couple of questions to Paul. Hopefully you have addressed them this morning or earlier on. One is the impact of spam on the DNS worldwide. Second question is the management of DNS worldwide is pretty lousy. I think that topic should be really addressed professionally. And the last one, you would expect me to ask a question about IPv6. What's the deployment of DNS over IPv6, especially using Anycast? Thank you.
Sure, spam and DNS. Well, spam is email and mostly, you know, it's responsible for a lot of the traffic that you know is in the DNS. People always talk to me about spammers attacking the DNS, and I kind of go, "Are you crazy? The last thing they want to have happen is mail not be delivered, right? I mean, that's, you know." So, you know, and I was incredibly amused by the whole set of efforts to do anti-spam. There was a whole, what was it, the married effort in the Ietf, where there was about a dozen different proposals about how to stop spam using sort of various lightweight forms of authentication. I think eventually what we will do is we will try and realize that you can't tell whether something, only the recipient can tell whether something is spam in the ultimate. Okay, I get announcements from my alma mater all the time about how I haven't sent them enough money. That's spam. You know, we all have, we have ex-universities, ex-girlfriends, ex-wives, ex-husbands, all of these people, and you don't really know a priori whether or not the traffic is spam or not until you read it. So, but what we can do is we can set things up so that I can prioritize traffic from known sources, if I can authenticate them, and put that at the top of my inbox. There's never, I get mail occasionally from, hi, I got one the other day, hi, I'm a grad student in Lithuania, and I know your name's Lithuanian, you know, let's talk about X. Well, you know, how do I know if that's spam or not, you know, because there's a lot of messages I get that are very similar about, hi, I'm a very nice girl and from Russia, and I want to talk to you, right? You know, I mean, so I would like to be able to, you know, authenticate mail from people that I would like, and I would like something where I could have multiple levels of that, where either a person could sign it directly or an institution could sign it. You know, like if it's specific people from MIT, I'll read their mail. If it's from MIT, I'll get to it. You know, I mean, if it's from EDU, I don't care. You know, and I think that's ultimately, I think we need to do DKIM or whatever is the thing over again in order to get to the most utility there. I made up a quote today because people deny that I actually heard it, and that is that IPv6 is a victim of its own success. I thought I'd offer that to you. But at any rate, the DNS is ready for IPv6, in my view.
Cool. Yes, please.
Hello. Is on? Okay. It's just a question. I don't know who to address to. Related
Please
to
also say who you are.
Sorry. My name is Fernando Barrio. I'm lecturing e-business law in London Metropolitan University. My question is about the future. I know that today is about history, but about how you see the future and whether my concern is whether that there are certain myths underlying the history or the story of the DNS and ICANN that probably will present a problem in the future. Let's start saying that I think that ICANN should stay. Last time I talked about ICANN was a very big issue in Rio. So let's try this time to make clear that I think ICANN should stay, but with some changes. So my problem is whether this myth, for example, that ICANN was repeated here again, is open, that represent the users. Every time I'm referee for the at-large, anyone that want to be at-large, one of the question is, does the person speak properly English? You probably know that most people in the planet don't speak English, so the question of whether it's open or not is something to be addressed. Then the fact that certain people are part of organizations that are in several places at the same time with this ICANN. My point is, I don't think that this is necessarily wrong. Probably it's a good feature of ICANN, the fact that these organizations are there, or probably English needs to be used. But my question is, don't you think that by denying reality and pretending that we are open, you are not opening the door to I2 or other people that will come to say, actually, these are lying because they are saying this? It's very easy to realize that some of the myths are not true anymore. So my question is this not time that we recognize and probably realize that what is going on is good? Probably we don't need to be that open, but don't claim to be open when we are not.
I suppose that's addressed to you, Dennis.
Well. I know that a lot of effort is made to try and be as open as possible. It's made from a largely US, OECD, wealthy, English-speaking, white Anglo-Saxon perspective. Nobody likes me saying that, but that's largely the reality. And one of the challenges is going to be to make it more genuinely open. I have no idea how to do that. And I link that to the IDNs and the need for more openness. But by any measure of any organization, ICANN is probably the most open organization that there exists. I mean, there was a phone board meeting the other day, and the draft minutes were back in 24 hours and probably were published today. I didn't actually get a chance to review them, so no idea what I said officially, but it's on the record, and therefore I did say it. And we try. Remember, he who writes the minute writes the record. We try and be as open as possible. I'd like us to be more open. I'm on the finance committee, and I'm arguing that the finances should be published every month, so everybody in the globe can know, what the budget is, where we are against budget, and so on and so on. And I'd like to see much more of that. But all I can say is we're trying to be as open as possible. But it's hampered by the sort of general perspective that I outlined at the beginning, that we came from a certain point, and it's going to take a long time to be truly open in the sense that you're asking. But I defy you to point to any organization that is more open. The only aspect of ICANN that is not as open as I would like is the GAC. But then the GAC people have told me, but if it was more open, we wouldn't talk. So that it wouldn't work at all. So I'm sorry, that's not an answer, but just an explanation of the problem.
Well, if you allow, I would like to add a comment on that. We went through the whole exercise of comparing the procedure of various institutions in terms of openness and transparency through the WSIS process. And in the working group of Internet governance, we really came to the conclusion that all the Internet institutions have nothing to hide in terms of openness and transparency. However, their criteria are maybe different from intergovernmental organizations. In the UN, you have an established criteria that you have 6 official languages. ICANN was mainly English-based, but ICANN since has done a lot of efforts to introduce other languages. I think that has been recognized. But there are different ways of being transparent, and WSIS basically gave good marks to the various internet institutions from ICANN to Ietf, saying they have done a good job. And I find looking also in the Internet Governance Forum that the Internet community continues to be engaged and to explain what they do. One of the problems is that the paradigms are somewhat different from the traditional intergovernmental organizations and the bottom-up structures of the internet institutions. But this is an ongoing process. There are 2 more demands for the floor, Bertrand here, and 3 more, and lady here, the bill there.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Bertrand de la Chapelle. I come from France and the French Foreign Affairs Ministry, and I'm the GAC representative for France. One remark and one question. First of all, I believe it would be a great pity if the ICANN were to become, as was suggested, a trade association for registrars and registries. In a certain way, it's already too much this way. It's probably more in the other direction that we need to go so that it is really fully multi-stakeholder and addressing all the issues. It's not only about developing the market, as we were discussing earlier. But the key point that I wanted to make and raise the question is related to IDNs. In the Latin script domain, there are CCTLDs and GTLDs for the history reasons that we heard. And there will be more and more. Suddenly, listening to the presentations, I was beginning to think, what if in a specific region, for instance, the Cyrillic group of countries that use Cyrillic or the Arabic script, what if they decided to have only CCTLDs, for instance, in order to have greater national control on the general thing? Imagine that the Roman script system that we're using today has only CCTLDs. The level of control of governments on the use of the internet, the domain name system policy and so would be completely different. What do you think of this hypothesis?
Well, first of all, I agree with you that ICANN should not just be a trade association. There is a certain amount of dominance of policy making as I view it. And I'm not speaking for the board, just reiterate, I'm a new boy here, but there seems to be a lot of influence from the registries and registrars, and I'm not convinced that consumer issues and so on are as well protected as they ought to be. But then, having said that, people will say, well, is it ICANN's role to protect consumer affairs? What is ICANN's role, and so on? But certainly, I think that there's a common good there which goes well beyond the registries and registrars, and somehow within the ICANN structures, those inputs have to become more vocal in the system. In terms of the IDNs and only having CCTLDs in any particular script, I think you have to recognize where we are. And where we are is that certain GTLDs see the IDNs as the new gold rush opportunity to create a replication of the Latin space and to quintuple or whatever their opportunity and profits. That may or may not be their view, but I suspect that some of them do see it as an opportunity. And I suspect that where we are, if one were to deny them that opportunity, that suit would be immediately filed against ICANN. And the last thing that ICANN needs is to become bankrupt through a suit taken in the US courts for restraint of trade or whatever the hell it is that the suit would be taken on. So I don't anticipate that only CCTLDs will be an outcome. But it does ask an interesting question, and it does then I refer you back to my whole process questions and sequence questions, but think about them in terms of a US corporation being potentially sued by a US organizations who regard this as their space. Indeed, one of the tensions that has immediately emerged between the GNSO, the Generic Name Support Organization, and the CNSO, or CCNSO, is who has policy responsibility for IDNs, which speaks to the issue that you raise. And there's not even a clear answer to that at this point in time. Thank you.
A few more questions. Lady in the front has been waiting patiently.
Good afternoon. My name is Becky Hogg, and I'm from an organisation called the Open Rights Group, which is an advocacy organisation for technology. And I'd like to ask those on the panel who were around at the time whether the history that Jonathan retold in the final presentation is something that they recognise. It's certainly a history that I grew up being told. One aspect in particular, and this may sound a very simple question compared to some of the more technical questions we've had today, but I'd really like it if you could answer it. This idea that those 5 principles on which the IETF functions, the last 2, everyone is nice and everyone is honest, do you recognise that those are 2 principles to which you were working? And if you do, given that you were building a network at the time that was to be used in the academic space in the United States, or at least that's what it was, we didn't think it would be the great big thing it is now. Do you still think that everyone on the network more or less is nice and honest?
I assume that's a rhetorical question. I think as far as the IETF goes, being nice is a goal rather than some metric that's consistently achieved. I don't really have any qualifications to say that other than having been there for a while and being IETF chair for a couple of years.
Well, I think Jonathan's telling of the history and the style of telling it, the lunatics style, could be applied to any history of anything. Let's take the history of the United Kingdom, Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and a similar presentation would have us rolling in the aisles. German kings and barons and red and white roses and so on. So yes, it's very amusing, and yes, it captures one aspect of it. But the balancing thing is the serious intent of all the people who are honestly trying to do something through this process is alluded to but missed in that sort of presentation. So it's very witty and very, very amusing. But it misses...
High backhanded praise indeed.
Yes. but you
are a diplomat, sir.
Yeah, I try to be. But talking about back when the network was being built, it was being built for the research community, and there's nothing that puts manners on research people than the peer review process. So when you're building something for the research community, bad behavior can be dumped on because you say, so you're one of those people, well then don't apply for a grant or publish a paper.
But I wanted to ask Paul real quick, was I right that I heard you refer earlier today to RFC 1149? I don't want to put you on the spot. That's standard for the transmission of IP datagrams on avian carriers.
No, I didn't refer to that, but I'm familiar with it, yeah.
April Fools.
Yes, I was just saying that was the RFC and how to implement Internet Protocol on carrier pigeons. And the follow-on, which was RFC 2549, about implementing on carrier pigeons with quality of service by weighting some of the pigeons down so the other ones could fly faster. I'm just saying there's a degree of whimsy in the organization that
that's
is
correct.
above average.
There's even another one.
Work, by the way. Field tested. Yeah, they were field tested.
There's another RFC that talks about research directions for ultra-low speed networks as well.
Can I try and answer the question as well? I actually think Jonathan's presentation was very, very largely true, and it certainly was told from a sarcastic point of view, and I wish actually I could have made
loving the sarcasm.
No,
It's romantic.
It's entertaining, thoroughly enjoyable, and I wish I could have made some of my points in much of the same framework. I think some of the principles that were not stated but actually drive much of the IETF as well are things. Well, first of all, it's the overall architecture of the net. It's a dumb network. Innovation, creativity is supposed to happen at the edges by people like all of you in the room, and it specifically facilitates that. Which today, actually, there's another corollary to that, because it means it's hard to change it. Because change can't be mandated, it can't be fiated, it can't be edicted, whether you do that through technical means or you try and do that through, in fact, policy or regulatory. And I think that's something we all need to come to grasp with as we actually look at how the internet will evolve over time. But some of the other principles that I think are behind what Jonathan was referring to as the be reasonable, be nice, are things like it should be principle of least surprise. So when a user does something, the result they get is what you would largely expect to get. And a lot of those principles don't drive for the same specificity that other technical bodies and similar standards might, because again of the assumption that all the intelligence, both on the input side and the receiving side, is actually with the users, with the individuals. And that, I think you'll see that play out a lot more as you look at some of the other technologies that the Ietf, but other bodies as well, are looking to deploy. That all the intelligence, input, output, creativity, innovation, actually happens on the edge of the internet at an individual level.
Thank you. Bill is pointing that drinks are waiting, but I have also several speakers, Bill Manning, Roberto Gaetano, and I think Emily Taylor, who have patiently been waiting. I wonder whether we can take these three more speakers, one after the other, and then maybe ask the panelists to make final comments. I see Suzanne actually jumped over Bill, who was waiting first, but Roberto, take it first.
Well, I just have a quick comment that was in additional answer to the question of the gentleman about openness and especially addressing languages. I think that I'm saying this for the people who have not attended an ICANN meeting, but there are translation in the local languages when the meetings happen in certain areas where the language is not English. Also in the ELAC, since, well, I'm Roberto Gaetano, I'm the vice chair of the board of ICANN, but I have been 3 years with ELAC. Especially the Latin American Caribbean regional organization. We have a lot of the traffic that on the mailing list that is going on in Spanish, because that's the simplest way to communicate. Obviously, at one point in time, like for air traffic control, as has been mentioned, we need to have some kind of common understanding. But there are efforts that are done in this sense. There are some tests that are being done by ICANN staff about translation, automatic translation, in order to have a multilingual mailing list. There are efforts. Of course, I agree that the situation is far from perfect, but at least there's the goodwill to go in that direction.
May I ask you to pass on the microphone directly to Bill?
So, Jonathan, this one's for you. You asked at the end of your presentation if there was anyone who could augment the history. Since I was on the other side of that for most of it, I would be willing to offer up an augmented history to add to that if the room is interested after the last speaker. Or after the last question. So I'll pass the baton to whoever asked.
Emily, behind you.
First.
Hi, Emily Taylor from Nominet. Since there have been several comments about registries being a bit badly run, I just wanted to raise my hand and say, by my silence, I do not consent or agree to that one, but happy to discuss it over drinks. We were talking about liberalisation or introducing more GTLDs into the namespace, and I'd just like to know the panel's view. Obviously, with greater competition comes greater risk of registry failure. What's the plan, guys?
Okay, shall we now go to the panelists to make their final remarks, if they have any, and then ask Bill to give his version of the story?
I think I'll withhold my remarks until I hear Bill's story.
Okay. Well, why don't you go first, Bill?
So, I'm going to pick up in the 1995.
Could you stand up, please?
Why?
Because it doesn't work.
Are guns legal? Okay, so only those people that are illegally having guns will shoot me. I'm going to pick up in 1995. In mid-1995, there were 9 root name servers, not 13. And there were a group of us that were looking at this growth of the internet because the connection technologies were moving from 9.6 and 56 kilobit links to T1s and T3s. Traffic was exploding. If you look at Larry Landweber's maps, you will see that many international connections were coming on board. And we recognized that the DNS infrastructure was being stressed. And so we had some discussions about how we were going to augment the DNS infrastructure to make it more robust so that it would not have the kinds of failures that looked like would happen, with most of the root name servers concentrated in the Washington, D.C. metro area. There was one outside the U.S. boundaries, and that was in Sweden. So what we did was we changed some of the naming structure so that the root name servers have single letters. This gave us the idea of compression so that we could fit more labels into that tiny space that Dr. Mockapetris gave us as the fundamental building block. And then we had 4 more. We said, okay, well, what are we going to do with these 4? Well, we instantiated them. VeriSign got 2, or actually Network Solutions at the time got 2, and ISI got 2. And the first thing that Jon said is, we need to figure out a way to get these outside the United States. And we looked for ways where grassroots organizations could pick them up. The RIPE NCC was an absolutely fine fit for Europe. It had good connectivity. It was membership driven. They agreed. So VeriSign picked up one of their extras, one of those 13, and it became K. The next group that we looked at was, well, the Asia-Pacific region has no representation at all. And we looked around, and the WIDE project in Japan fit similar. So we moved one over there. They wanted J really badly. They didn't get it. They have M. And that left 2 remaining, L and J. And before we could get L and J moved offshore, Jon Postel passed away. L moved to ICANN as its temporary home, and J stayed with VeriSign as a temporary expedient until we could figure out what to do. Those temporary expedients have become entrenched permanent, or apparently entrenched permanent operational entities, with VeriSign now holding 2 root name servers, and ICANN, which probably shouldn't have an operational role, having an operational role. During that particular process, from 95 to 96, when we actually redid this, we also looked at IPv6. DNSSEC in its early implementations was available. And so the root server, some of the root server operators got together and we said, what we're going to do is we're going to look at this continuity of operations. How do we add new features? And we created an alternate route that was IPv6 reachable and signed. And we were testing things out on that. About 6 months before this date in 1998, Jon said, what we need to do is we need to create the idea of a distribution master. Using A as the golden root name server is probably a mistake because it's serving the data to customers as well as being the source of the data. And so we experimented and we created a test machine called ns.iana.net. That served as the distribution point for the root zone. And we tested that for about 6 months. And there were 2 instances prior to this date when some of the root name servers were told to pick up the root data from this new space. It was never B or L. It was this other machine that nobody knew about. And that worked. And on the January date, half of the root name servers were asked to move, including J from VeriSign. VeriSign was part of that. And they moved. I don't know who reported this as a problem, or why. I'm not sure that your explanation is entirely accurate. The response with the people without a sense of humor in suits and funny bulges was accurate. And we came to the realization that sovereign entities, governments, have a legitimate role because sovereign entities and governments have guns, and they can, in fact, come and confiscate your kit and take it away and lock you up and say, no, you can't play with these toys anymore. And so that was, in fact, for me, the crystallizing moment that said that we can't ignore constituencies simply because they don't play by our rules. We have to include them. They have to be part of the calculation. They're part of the community that we need to serve. They're not the predominant community we have to serve, but we have to serve them too. We can't ignore them. And a lot of the discussion that's come on after that, I mean, this whole continuity of operations thing really, I mean, we were thinking about it a long time ago, and then ICANN came into existence. ICANN had its birthing pains, but now it's old enough that it really needs to come back and revisit these things that say, how do you actually maintain a robust system without necessarily having a centralized points of control? Because as long as there are centralized points of control, there will be people who want to control them. So that's sort of my spin on the history. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that. Now back to our panelists. Any reactions or any last words?
A couple of quick things. First of all, to Emily, yes, things will fail, and yes, that's going to have to be part of the planning. You can't open up to an unlimited number, which is conceptually what's been done, without recognizing that it is recognized there was a registrar failure, which I gather was a bit catastrophic, and action has been taken to deal with that. There's a lot of escrow work has gone on. I don't believe any of the escrow has actually been tested. I don't think a recovery has actually been tested, which of course is the first thing you have to do. Any of you back up your computers? Probably a few of you. How many of you who back them up have actually recovered your computer from your backup? Oh, wow. I haven't. Anyway. And on the history, my recollection of those days is that not only the US government, but other governments were very alarmed that the techies were becoming uncontrollable when those trials went on, and shouted very loudly in the ear of the United States government that really something has to be done. And you're right, these things now have to be revisited in a way that gives comfort to all those stakeholders that things are being done and being done properly, and that's a very significant challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I was in ARPA inside of the U.S. government for a while, and one of the meetings I remember being invited to, and since I was there in the very early '90s, must have preceded your adventures. I was late to the meeting, and I came in, and there was John and Dave Crocker and a bunch of other people, and they were talking about, well, there's this DNS stuff you probably will interest you, Paul. And I said, well, okay, what's going on? And they said, well, we're going to temporarily redo this so that during a test period, it's going to come from this particular source, and we'll revamp the distribution of all this data and so forth. And I said, oh, okay, and what ends the test period? And they said, well, we'll see how it goes. And I said, so you just want to take over, right? One man's philosopher king is another guy's terrorist and all like that. I think that the real issue here is that we ought to try and figure out how to tell our government in the sense of ICANN and our government in the sense of US and France and so forth. Because I mean, one of the things on that org chart is the US government and ICANN is never going to tell anybody that has a 1 or a 2-digit country code what to do with their domain. Okay? I mean, it's just not going to happen, right? ICANN doesn't control any of the big countries in Europe. I don't know if there's anyone little enough that they could. Can you control Monaco maybe? I don't know.
Pitcairn Island, don't forget.
There you go. So, you know, I mean, the good thing about the technology is the country code, you know, TLDs can always potentially be an island of sanity or multiple islands of sanity. And, you know, I think that you have to recognize that. ICANN has to figure out how to deal with the fact that a bunch of the things that are under it in the org chart are things that it can't really control, including the countries. I think they'll have to struggle and go forward. But I think what you ought to do is continue to, you know, somebody asked, what can you do about ICANN openness? Demand it, okay? I mean, I used to like it when Carl Auerbach was there. I mean, how is it that we've had so many ICANN directors and only one that wanted to spill the beans all the time? You know, I think, you know, I mean, it's very suspicious, right? And then, you know, they say, and people say, it's terrible that ICANN is a California corporation. Well, it was kind of delightful when Carl was saying, you know, California law says I have an absolute right to do this. I think you need to demand the openness, and I think that reform will come, but don't ease up on them. That's my advice.
Thank you. Mike?
I would just say that the internet's now gotten to the point where it's so big and so distributed and become a mass communications medium as its dominant mode of operation, that progress in however you wish to define that is really going to be the result of a series of political consensus events, both national and international, trying to recapture some quasi piece of the prior culture, academic networks and geeks and so on. You know, it has a lot of attraction. It's great memory lane, and it's, you know, completely unrealistic. So, you know, those of us who want to see a positive outcome to this, you know, have to say, all right, you got to go to Washington, you know, you got to go to London, you got to go to Dublin, and you got to talk to people there about how their national governments need to behave about all this.
Turning to this side. Final remarks, please.
I want to respond to the question about openness as well. I've been testing for years, you know, myself about that ICANN is actually a very open organization. And you know, back in '99 when I started working on IDNs, ICANN was the only place. Well, Ietf the other one. ICANN was the only place that could talk about policies, and you are able to talk about it. ITU certainly didn't allow me to speak at that time, and none of the other places. You know, allowed me any entrance. But having said that, I just realized that, you know, it's been so many years, and I have been hearing this for a little more recently. So maybe I have already become, you know, part of that group now, and there's no point me attesting that anymore, and I really need to look into. You know, how to make it more open, but I really think that it was pretty open, especially when it was formative years in '99 and 2000, around that time. The other part I want to respond to is about the IDNs. Paul made a comment about, you know, if he would be seeing Korean domain name, then he wouldn't need to access it, and maybe that was the whole intent. And also, you know, whether IDNs eventually will make it, if you will, and be adopted generally. And I get this question all the time about, you know, what do you think about IDNs? How I guess what do you hope for IDNs to accomplish ultimately? And here's sort of my vision and view is that when the day comes that, you know, most of the people using the internet really, you know, take IDNs for granted, and there's no distinction between domain names and IDNs, and that's when we can say that IDN is fully deployed and successful.
Lynn?
Try and be brief and just say I would encourage people to lean into what might seem like the absurdity of the internet and the absurdity of developments that have brought you the internet. Bob Kahn and Vince Cerf are really fond of saying if they had had to develop the internet in the sort of public view and with the scrutiny it's getting today, with all the concerns from all the interested parties, the internet never would have been developed. And I think to the extent that we can put formalization or politicization in only where we need it and only to the extent we need it, that will serve the internet best overall. To date, it's been a relatively light hand, partly because, as Vinton Bob's example just showed, it was developed largely under the radar, and they were actually able to do it and deploy it. And many of the other comments we've heard today about the innovation happening in pitches, we don't know where the next change will come from, or the next great idea, whether it's a technical idea or a policy idea, but just remain open to the absurdity or the possible lunacy of things with respect to development of the internet, to borrow your phrases.
You barred it so well I couldn't possibly top what you just said, so I just incorporate what she said by reference.